So I'm honored to be here, alhamdulillah. And I want to start off by thanking Sister Wajiha and the Masjid leadership for allowing us to be here. CARE New York, like I said, is a civil rights organization. We offer free legal representation for folks that are experiencing discriminatory issues. And the entire point of our service is to make sure that the mission of this masjid, which is to be a place that worships, that allows for the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you living and worshiping as a Muslim is not confined to these four walls. In other words, you have every right to be a Muslim in every realm of life. Whether you're a student at school, or whether you're at your job, or whether you're in the masjid space, or whether you're a citizen just walking through the supermarket like everybody else, you don't shed your Muslim identity just because you're not within the confines of the masjid. That's not what the United States of America is about. And of course, we're entitled to the same rights as everyone else, regardless of our faith or our national origin, and in most cases, even regardless of our immigration status. But what we have seen in this KYR centered around what is happening with Palestine in particular, that's the topic for today, and there are many more different kinds of Know Your Rights workshops that we do. But in particular, with what is happening with our brothers and sisters in Gaza and across Palestine, we have seen a massive suppression of those rights when it comes to Muslims advocating for what is happening in Palestine. So my job is twofold here. First and foremost is to make sure that you are empowered to be able to advocate for our brothers and sisters, because I just told you that you have every right as a citizen to do so. And it is your constitutionally protected right to do so. But then to balance it with what those rights are and using some wisdom, some hikmah, as our faith teaches us, to make sure that we're doing it in such a way that doesn't have negative impact on us, our family members, our employment status, and so on, right? So there's the balance. But it is really critical to start with the empowerment part, because as every single one of you know, Israel would not be able to do what it does without us here in America, right? And so that places us as Muslim Americans in a very, very special role, that if we want things to change, whether we're talking about the Palestine issue or any other issue across the board, whether we're talking about the Islamophobia that's rising in India, whether we're talking about the Rohingya in Burma, whether we're talking about the Uyghurs in China, all these issues around the world, the US can be the base to change the trajectory of history in every single one of those circumstances. So, I always say that, alhamdulillah, I think we have the best opportunities to live our Islam in this country because, number one, we don't take it for granted. We're a minority. So, for example, I come from Yemen. Islam is just in the air. You don't think critically about it, consciously about it. You don't fight for it the way that we fight for it here, right? But I think that this extra endeavor, inshallah, will allow us to be rewarded better, bi'idhnillah, with Allah's permission in the hereafter, but it also makes us better and stronger Muslims, inshallah. So we have to fulfill our duty at the very base minimum of trying to advocate as strongly and as persistently as we can for our brothers and sisters in Palestine. You've all seen the imagery. We're all walking around with hearts that are broken, but we have to translate that pain into activism. Now, here are the issues with activism. I'm going to break it up into three specific areas. I probably won't do the student thing too much because I see that we don't have too many students here. I'll reserve that for questions, and if you want me to come back for a youth one, I'll be happy to do so. Activism when it comes to protests, joining all these protests that are happening everywhere, right? What are your rights? What do you need to know before you head into a protest? What happens when law enforcement comes and tries to confine those rights as a protester? And then within the workplace, because we've seen massive suppression within the workplace, and I'll touch a little bit about what's happening in schools as well, inshallah. Okay, so let's start with the protesters. So every other day there's a protest somewhere, if not every day, all right? There are certain organizations that have been doing a phenomenal job at being very persistent. And it's not just Muslim organizations. And I think that's really, really important to realize this and to see this. If you've been at a protest anywhere, especially in the city, you'll see as many non-Muslims as you do Muslims at the protests these days. And the reason for that, my brother, and the reason we've seen so much suppression of our rights because we're advocating for Palestine is because the trajectory of the image of what is happening is now changing. I've been in this country since I was 2 years old. I'm over 40 now, okay? The way that I have seen the masses, the narrative around what is happening in Palestine has shifted tremendously, tremendously, right? The world is now on the side of the right against the oppression. And so because of the narratives changing, in part because of social media, in part because of the realization that this oppression and suppression is not just nuclear, just to Palestine, in part because they see the relevance to it, to the apartheid of South Africa. So many things are connecting the world and making the oppression be as clear as we've always known it to be. Because of this shift, what we've seen is employment terminations or HR appointments. We've seen suspensions in schools, and we've seen law enforcement crackdowns at protests in a massive way. These are the three areas that we've been seeing so many calls. As a matter of fact, CARE New York usually spots around 250 calls of requests for assistance on a yearly basis. We got over 240 that were Palestine-related alone in October, November, December. So our numbers doubled this year, mainly because of those last 3 months. Okay. Now, in terms of employment, it's a bit tricky, and I'm going to say this, and I'm going to leave some time for Q&A. I know this is a 1-hour session. The reason that it's a little bit tricky with employment is because it depends on who your employer is. That is the basis of where you have to start when thinking about what you can do in employment. Is it government-based employment, meaning you work for a government entity, or is it private-based? Generally speaking, you have more rights within a government institute than you do a private institute. And the reason for that is private institutions are exactly that. They're private. They have more authority to make up their own rules. They can make up their own value systems that fit within the company. But those values cannot contradict the Constitution and laws that apply to them, right? And so there's this constant, push and pull between private employees and the laws. What is permissible, what is not permissible, okay? But what we advise every single one of you to do, and again, the base of this is you have the rights, the constitutional right to free speech. But even free speech has parameters. First and foremost, whether we're talking about at a protest, employment, or at school, you have to understand what is legal free speech and what is not legal in terms of the free speech world. Okay. Hate speech, by a show of hands. If anybody needs to get their phone, it is ringing. Maybe whoever owns it is testing it, seeing where it is. So what is hate speech? What is legal and what is not legal? What can you post that might get you in trouble at work versus what you can't post? What can you say? What can't you say? Hate speech. Is hate speech legal? Out of a show of hands, who thinks that hate speech is legal? Meaning, I hate all, and you name one ethnicity of people, they should go to hell. Let's just say you write that. Is that legal or illegal? I got, well, legal. Anybody think otherwise? So hate speech is legal speech. It's legal. You can say, I hate so-and-so. We can say, I hate the President of the United States. People say it all the time, right? So hate speech in and of itself, showing hatred towards one thing or even one people, is legal. Now, is it wise for us to do it, especially as Muslims and Arabs? Is there hikmah in utilizing it and pushing the law to its furthest extent? I'll be honest with you, because my job is to be honest with you. If you're white and your name is John, maybe you could get away with it. When you're Muslim and you look like us, you're less likely to get away with hate speech. And so we have to determine what the boundaries are in terms of practicality, right? And again, I don't like the double standard, and I'm ready to fight it, as long as you're ready to fight it, but understand that there might be a fight. If you're trying to do a certain if you're trying to push a certain narrative and bring awareness to the cause of Palestine, then use hikmah in doing it, because that's what the Palestinian organizations are telling you themselves. They want their message out. It's not going to help if you're stuck in court and you can't say anything, right? So when I say use hikmah, hate speech is legal. What is illegal is when that speech becomes threatening or violent in any way. When you are inciting violence in any way. What does that mean, to incite violence? So let's say you say, we should burn down every store that has an Israeli flag on it. That's incitement to violence, right? So that is when you have to be careful. And I know I'm giving very obvious examples, but let me give you another example in which we had a child questioned by law enforcement. A teenager decided, you know what a parody is? Basically a skit in which you're being sarcastic, okay? So she plays out a skit being sarcastic, and she literally took what the other side had said about Palestinians, but she switched it. She switched the wording so that it was about, the other side of the conflict. And in it, there was some, potential interpretation for violence. Now, her entire thinking was, I'm just copying what they did and I'm just being sarcastic to show how crazy it is what they're saying. But she's the one that got questioned by law enforcement, right? So do not incite violence, or do not say anything that anyone can interpret as a safety threat to them. How are we seeing this in terms of employment? The three biggest areas we're seeing this being played out in employment is the medical field. I'm sure you guys have seen on social media, residents, doctors, have been threatened. In the education field, teachers have been really scared to be able to say things in the classroom, and if they do, even on their own time, there are issues that come up. And even within the legal field, where the law firms literally rescinding offers that were already given to graduates because of their activity within pro-Palestine movements, okay? So again, why is that even possible? How do they get away with it? You said we have free speech, and they're not saying anything violent. So how could the HR department call me in and say that my job is at jeopardy, or they need to investigate me when I have said nothing that is violent, right? And I haven't incited anyone else to be violent. So what is the issue here? The issue here is that each company, especially when private, has, number one, a contract that you signed that nobody reads and forgets about very quickly. And they often have policy manuals that you also have to adhere to. And within those policy manuals, there are social media policies that nobody ever reads, right? And in that policy manual are core values in the way the company wants to project themselves. Let me give you guys an example within the medical field which has been used, and then I'll tell you how we've been countering it. Within the medical field, for example, we've had residents who have not said anything violent. They may be even Palestinian themselves, and they're calling attention to the genocide in one way or another, okay? They've been called in because supposedly these posts make their patients or their colleagues feel unsafe around them, okay? That is very subjective, first and foremost, right? It's also nonsense, in my opinion. But that is the basis in which people have been called into HR. Think about it from the teacher perspective. Students and other teachers now feel uncomfortable to be around that individual, right? So you see that where there are, especially in professions that require very almost intimate spaces between somebody who's being served, maybe between a child, hospital situation, says it can potentially make people feel uncomfortable to be seen by that physician. Well then, the biggest question is, for all these private companies that are saying this is, have you been monitoring what the other side are saying? We have a situation even within our Care New York board, and I know I'm okay to say this, where we have one of our board members as a pilot for a major airline. I mean, he flies all around the world. He's Palestinian, he's been posting. Obviously, he knows the social media policy, he's not a fool. He's read it through several times, he's posting within the guidelines. He got doxxed. You guys all know what doxing means? Doxing is when somebody takes your image and your words and they plaster it. Usually they twist it maliciously and they start spreading it and they send it to your employer. And usually there's a campaign in which many people start calling and messaging your employer in order to agitate what is the scenario to get you fired. We see doxing within the student issues too, where they send it to the school, and that's why we have a lot of school issues as well. Right now, currently, there's a lawsuit against Harvard. We just met with NYU for students that were being threatened with suspension. You all know what's been happening with Columbia University. The CUNY systems with loads of Muslims are all under fire, right? We've been meeting with the governor, gave money and appointed a special person to investigate all the CUNY systems to see whether or not they're safe and how to handle anti-Semitism. And then we said, where's Islamophobia? So they put Islamophobia in there. But the point is there's immense movements happening within the college systems and the employment sector. So even with the hospital systems, okay, what we have said is, all right, let's play this game according to your rules. Have you been monitoring everybody's social media? And are you ready to fire the chairman of this department, the chairman of that department, the chairman of that department, the doctor here, and the doctor here? Because we know the other side has been just as vocal, and even in a private company, you cannot have a disparity between what you do to one person versus what you do to another person. Because that would be discriminatory, right? So if you're going to treat everyone to that standard, if you're saying the policy exists because you are cultivating a certain value system within the company that everyone must adhere to, then it has to be applied equally across the board. Brother. It's a civil lawsuit if they don't, for sure. And that's how we got residents back into NYU Langone. Yeah. No, alhamdulillah. And it was because of that. Because there was a chairman who was also posting and was very vocal, and they were not ready to fire the chairman of somebody else, right? Long story short, that chairman actually got completely indignant about the fact that he was being called in, and there's a story behind that as well. But the point is our resident got back in, alhamdulillah. Yeah, that is absolutely leverage, but it's not just that. We're taking it a step further with other employment sectors, like the one with the airline. What we're telling the airlines is, are you really ready to monitor not just the issues that are happening in Palestine, but every controversial issue? Abortion, gun control, even the vaccine, the COVID vaccine. How about politics? We're in an election year, right? Trump's, everything else. Immigration, are you now going to monitor all these controversial issues and start applying this value system some way across the board through everyone's social media now? So we are really pushing the limits because we know that this is a facade. It's a way to target the Muslims, to silence them. But the one thing that is required is that it requires a challenge. And that's key here. Because oftentimes our community is not willing to challenge these things. We want to be the good people and to stay silent and don't rock the boat. And that's fine to some degree. And I understand that mentality too. First generation, my parents. You know, I joke, my dad doesn't know half the things that goes on, you know, with what I do, because his intent is to protect and to keep things calm, right? But if we don't challenge these authorities, what happens? The truth is, as the reason that our folks on other sides have been so good at pushing the agenda is because they are tremendously vocal on everything that happens, right? So the question is what's the official position on Biden? Because we all know, and he has said it, He's very Zionist. He has said, I'm a Zionist. I don't need to be Jewish to be a Zionist, and I'm a Zionist. He has said it, and he's been supportive from the get-go and continues to be. If you're asking me as a care rep, I can't give you that answer. Not right now, anyway. We're a C3 organization, and so is this masjid. And this masjid, just kind of as a side note here, be careful with what you do with the elections. We'll be happy to talk to the board on what's permitted within the parameters of what you're permitted and what you aren't, and what. But is there an official position that's coming out within the broader Muslim community? There are movements there, and you see what's happening in Michigan, for example, right? And that is a wave that's hitting different places. It's not one that I can advocate for, again, as a C3, and I am here on behalf of the organization. I have my personal opinions on that, which I can speak to personally on the side, but in terms of that, there are movements that are happening on how to deal with politicians who have been very staunch and who have even failed to recognize the deaths, who have not said the word genocide once, who have refused to do a ceasefire resolution, which is just the most basic level of humanity, is to say, stop the bloodshed. And yet, the majority of politicians have failed to do that. Okay. Going back to the workplace, you see how we're challenging it, but I did say something else. Private companies are different from government entities, and that's because government entities are legally not permitted to stifle a person's speech based on their political stand. So you actually have more rights within the government sector than you have in the private sector. But again, every situation is different, and we ask you all to please go back to your office policy manuals, read your social media guides, and do not sign any documents. Don't resign if you are in trouble. A lot of people have this instinct to resign. Please do not resign until you speak to an attorney first. Oftentimes, resigning makes things more difficult for you, legally speaking, because you've voluntarily left, right? So it makes the challenge a lot more difficult, okay? Don't sign any documents and speak to someone before you go to your HR appointment if they call you in, okay? All right, so then within protests, and I had said I was gonna start there and I diverted, I apologize. Protests happening every other day. The biggest issue with protests are two things. If you're organizing a protest, some basic things you need to know. You are legally permitted to have a protest and to assemble. Constitutionally, that is the foundation of this country, right? Protest. Revolution was a big protest against the British king, right? That is really the basis of this country. So the freedom to assemble and to protest is very well established and protected. You are allowed to protest in any public space, generally speaking. However, you need to know what your local laws say about permits that are required. Okay? And you're allowed to protest over any issue. They can't stifle what your issue is. That's not the issue. The problem is that sometimes we use amplified sound, meaning speakers, right? Or we're going to march, meaning we're going to cross streets and block traffic. Or even if it's a stationary protest, you're not permitted to take up more than half the sidewalk because you have to allow for people to exit and enter and walk for pedestrian spaces. So in situations in which you're going to use amplified sound or there's going to be a march, you usually, and I say usually because it differs from county to county, should get a permit. So you need a permit for that. Permit is very minimal. It's like 20 bucks or something to get it usually. It's not a big deal, but you just need to plan for it in advance. Okay. Otherwise, you are allowed to go onto any public space. Private spaces, completely different matter. Private spaces is trespassing. Okay. So you can't do a sit down in the hallway of your private employer without them calling security and getting you arrested, unless you have a pro-Palestinian employer. Right? But you get my point here. Okay, so public spaces. The second issue we see with protests is how law enforcement have been engaging with us. NYPD is the largest police department, not just in the nation, but in the world. It's like 40,000 police officers. They have a special department specifically for protesters called the SRG, the Strategic Response Group. If you go onto the website, you will see them using language that akins or that compares protesters to terrorists. On the website, it's there. So that is the mentality of them going into these protests to begin with. I'm using NYPD as an example, but this is not just applicable to NYPD because Nassau County, we were just met with the Nassau County Police Commissioner a few weeks ago, and we did some formal complaints into the Nassau County Police as well. I don't know what the state is in terms of protesters with Suffolk County. Certainly, if you have any issues, you should contact us and we can talk about that, inshallah. Okay. So what we have seen is law enforcement being really aggressive with protesters, in particular the SRG folks. And I have had 14-year-olds punched in the face. I've had people arrested, masses of people. Usually the Muslim brown looking ones or non-Muslim brown, okay? Now we also know that we have a lot of allies that are doing protests that most of us would not be able to organize because we know the consequences would be far greater. I'll give you guys an example. JVP, Jewish Voices for Peace, is an excellent Jewish ally organization that are very anti-Zionist and have been on almost every single week. They're doing some movement. They shut down Grand Central Station. Okay. Now you can imagine the response if it was you and me shutting down Grand Central Station. As a matter of fact, one of SRG's, and the Nassau County Police Commissioner actually said this to me when we were in a meeting with him. He said, well, when protesters are chanting, shut it down, because that is one of the chants that we say, if we don't get it, meaning if we don't get peace or our demands, what do? Shut it down. That's one of the protest slogans. They say, it makes us nervous that you guys are gonna try to shut down the streets or whatever. My response to him was, you can't act out of what could happen. You can only act as to what does happen, number one. And number two, and I didn't say this, we all know the disparity in the way we're being treated because you have JVP shutting down Grand Central Station in rush hour. They had some arrests, they're well organized, they have people who are already waiting, you know, at the police precinct. Everything goes smoothly, but they're not gonna get punched and it's not gonna be violent. So what we tell people is a number of things with law enforcement. And it's one of the reasons why I gave you guys the Know Your Rights card for law enforcement. Number one, first and foremost, if you're ever arrested at a protest or anywhere else, your right to remain silent is a real right. It's not just one that they do in police shows on TV. Okay? Please stop talking to law enforcement. I'm begging you guys. I'm begging the entire community. Because we have had many, many situations in which people want to show that they're good and they haven't done anything wrong out of our good niyyah, good intentions. But we end up digging ourselves in a hole that could otherwise be avoided every time you open your mouth. So please utilize our advices, utilize your right to remain silent. Secondly, in most cases, what happens is you get a desk appearance ticket and they let you out the next day or the same day, depending on what time of day it is. You'll have to come back to clear the criminal record at some point. Depending on what the circumstances is, a lot of the courts and the prosecutors have been pushing them out because they know what's happening. And there's just so many of them, right? So for the most part, people have just been getting out on the other side. But just the issue itself of being violently grabbed and put into a car is an experience that obviously is traumatic in and of itself, right? And of course, when you're in custody, that doesn't mean you shed your Islamic identity even while you're in custody. Meaning, you're a sister who wears hijab, your hijab is torn off during whatever it is, the mayhem, you have a right to have your hijab on. And we have sued police agencies in New York City, the NYPD, and Suffolk County actually is a lawsuit. I don't know if you guys saw it in the news. It's actually happening now, and Nassau County, we've done that in the past. We've done it in Yonkers. So there are lots of issues in terms of religious accommodations that they violate when you're in custody, right? So understand that your religious accommodations, including your right to pray, if you're there held for any, and inshallah, you never have to experience this, but my job is just to give you the basics anyway. And if you are held there for a prolonged period of time, which you shouldn't for a protest or violation, but you know, God forbid there's something else going on, you're permitted to pray, you're permitted to ask for halal food. So in other words, they cannot hold back your religious accommodations even when you are in custody. Okay. All right. So, inshallah, you never get arrested, but what should you know? Number one, you can film what's going on. These days, police officers have the body cams, right? Good evidence for us and for them. But you can also take out your phone and film. That is permitted. But the advice is use a little bit of judgment. Don't go into somebody's face, because if they're agitated, you don't need physical assaults, right? So use your common sense in these situations. Number two, understand that if you have your phone open, they could potentially go through it. You may not want them to go through it, right? So understand that as well. I get questions about pepper spray. Are you allowed to have pepper spray at a protest? Technically, pepper spray is legal in New York. Do you want to take it to a protest, though? Probably not, right? By the way, there's some limitations. Since I just said it now, I have to give the little asterisk. If you do get pepper spray, so for example, if you're traveling the subways all the time and it's late at night and you want your daughter or whatever to have pepper spray, it has to be bought through a legitimate vendor that the city recognizes, FYI. So there are some restrictions with that you want to check out. But anyway, any other weapon? Don't even try to bring it. And by weapon, I don't mean that you're trying to carry a knife into the protest, but anything that can be conceived as a weapon. You're holding a sign, hold it with a hollow cardboard, right? Hollow cardboard. Don't tape it up to a piece of wood from your backyard or a 2x4 that's, sitting there in the corner. That will be seen as a weapon, right? Second thing, don't resist arrest. When you resist arrest, things become more violent, and that's a separate charge against you. Third thing, if you do open up your mouth, never, ever, ever lie to law enforcement in any situation. Why? Number one, it's a federal offense, and you can get into a lot of trouble for it. It's an offense in and of itself that is a criminal offense that can get you jail time. Flip side of that is that law enforcement can and do lie to you all the time. It's a part of their ability to investigate. So they can lie to you. You cannot lie to them. One of the reasons we tell you never to speak to law enforcement is because you can unintentionally misrepresent information. They ask you about something, you forgot that 2 years ago you did see that individual, now it's a misrepresentation. So that's why we say never speak to law enforcement. Just utilize your right. If they're coming to your door, your answer is leave your business card in the mailbox, I'll have my attorney contact you. You don't have to open the door ever unless they have a search warrant or an arrest warrant. Our advice is you never open the door because and we're talking about police or FBI or any other agency. It's across the board. So don't even open the door because there's a dynamic there, an intimidation dynamic that changes dramatically once you're face to face with two agents, right? And to be honest, even those that are adults that have heard this advice a million times, even lawyers can get nervous about this when you're face to face and there's agitation or tension. That's natural. So the best form of protection is to say, slip your business card under the door, leave it in my mailbox, I'll have my attorney contact you. So unless they have a search warrant or an arrest warrant, you don't need to open the door, and don't answer any more questions, you walk away from the door. Simple as that. Okay. Do you have to have an attorney already, meaning you already hired somebody? No. First of all, we are your attorneys at CARE New York, right, for this type of thing. So you would call us, we would call up the agent, and we would say, agent officer so-and-so, we're representing so-and-so, what's the issue here? Why did you visit them? What information do you need? So that we can determine whether this is a legitimate investigation for some reason. Maybe it's about something you saw a week ago or whatever, and they're just looking. There could be a legitimate reason. But the difference is now they know that there's an attorney who's scrutinizing what is being asked, and we're going to keep it minimal, meaning the majority of things that FBI and others go to, and this has been happening a lot now, in particular with the Yemeni community, and I'll explain why, is that there's a lot of fishing for information. Okay. And when you're fishing for information, not only are they gathering information about you, but of your family members, your friends, your Masjid, your political agendas, everything else, right? And we have had people literally invite them in and talk to them for 2 hours. They've had people show them their phone willingly, which gets me to another point. You never consent to a search, okay? You never consent to a search, taking this back to the protest. Don't resist arrest. If an officer comes and questions you, your response to the police officer is, "Officer, am I under arrest? Or am I free to go?" If he says you're free to go, then you're free to go. If he doesn't say you're free to go, you repeat, "Am I free to go? Am I free to go?" They're questioning you. "Can I see your phone? What's your whatever? What's your problem? Why are you pushing up against people?" Whatever it is, whatever the confrontation is. "Officer, am I free to go? Officer, am I free to go? Officer, am I free to go?" This is your only interaction with law enforcement at a protest or in any public space. If they say, "No, you're not free to go," or they don't answer you, you say, "Am I under arrest?" Because that's the only way they can hold you, is if you are now going to be in custody, if they're going to arrest you. If you're under arrest, then that's when "don't speak to anyone" kicks in, right? Okay, let's say you're not under arrest. They want to see your backpack that you're wearing, or your pocket, or your wallet. Do you have to show your ID? How many say you have to show your ID when asked by law enforcement? No? Okay. So your different states have different laws on this. In New York, technically you don't have to show your ID. However, if they need to verify your ID, they now have the ability to take you to the station until your identification is verified. So what we say is because we know that interactions do happen in protests, you should carry ID. It's fine to show them your ID, but don't take like your passport, right? Where they can see every Hajj trip you've made. "I've been to this place, I've been to that place." No need for that. Take something minimal, okay? Beyond that, you don't consent to any search. Not your phone, not your backpack, nothing. Why? Because once you consent to a search, everything that they see, whether it's from you or somebody sent you or whatever, it's now applicable and damaging to you. And you've allowed it because you've consented. You volunteered that information. When you do not consent to a search, if they search you, if they search your bag, if they search your car, if they search anything, your response is very clearly and calmly say, "I do not consent to any search." Because then you're going to tell your lawyer, and your lawyer's going to go into court and say, "You can't use anything that was found because there was no search warrant, and my client didn't consent to a search." In the situation that I told you of that, we had another situation also with a young person, Palestine related, and I'll speed this up, but I think this is just to show you how egregious things have become. You guys know that there was one day in which people were saying, "Boycott everything, don't go to work, don't go to school." You guys remember that? It was one day. So one family decided they were going to do this, and they told their child, "You don't have to go to school that day." The child went and messaged several people, I don't know if it's on social media, or messaged folks, students in his class. His one sentence was, "Don't go to school on so-and-so date." He didn't further explain, he just said that. Immediately, that became a cause for a safety concern. That would have never happened if he wasn't Muslim. Let's be real, never. But they interpreted the words, "Don't go to school," as if there's being a threat, a safety threat onto the school. So the kid got suspended, suspension hearings challenged, right? But the reason that I'm even bringing this up is to see how sensitive our words have become coming through our mouths, right? Not only that, and the reason I bring him up in this situation, because there's a safety issue, local law enforcement was called. Local law enforcement visited the household, the parents spoke to them, and allowed them to search the kids' room. The cop said, "Can I take a look in the room?" They said, "Yeah, sure," knowing that their kid is good. He's a good kid. He's, really good kid. Alhamdulillah, they didn't see anything or find anything there, but can you imagine if there was anything at all problematic in that room or anything that could be interpreted as problematic? Never consent to a search, ever. All right, so that's law enforcement. And then in terms of, school, I kind of started touching base on what's happening with school. I'm going to make this, many of you guys are parents here. Please teach your kids that they don't have to defend themselves in school spaces. That's our job. Your job as a parent and our job as community organizations and leaders. There's no 9-year-old, 13-year-old, 14-year-old that should have to stand in front of their principal and defend their perspective on any political issue. You guys remember 9/11, what happened? My sister is the youngest, only Muslim girl in the 3rd grade class. Teacher makes an example of her. Hey, Selma, what do you think about what happened? What are your parents saying about what happened? That's not okay. We do not allow our kids to become scapegoats or to become alienated in the classroom because of political issues and where the administration stands on them, number one. Number two, if your kids are posting on social media, as we know that many of them are or are active in protests, right, and they get doxxed, and teach your kids, and you should all know this as protesters too, let's not be foolish. There are people that are specifically sent a lot of times to protest to antagonize you as a protester, right? I've had people go to Islamic schools waiting for kids to come out just to say nasty things so that they can get a threat back, and there's somebody behind a car waiting to tape them. So doxing is real, and it has had serious, serious consequences for kids. So let's teach ourselves and our kids not to be foolish, keep your calm. Your job is to speak a certain narrative, which is what I'm going to end with in a couple of minutes. But if your kid gets questioned by a guidance counselor, a teacher, a principal, what I've been telling all the kids to do and their parents to teach their kids is to shut down the conversation. Why? Because there's a power struggle there. There's a power imbalance. And I've told this to principals. We met with the DOE chancellor, and there were a number of principals, and I turned to the principals. And I said, what you're doing to these kids is repulsive, and I'm telling you to your faces that I'm telling our kids to shut down the conversation and not to answer you. Because if you have a legitimate issue, you speak to the parent, not to the child. So what we're telling our kids to say is, if you get questioned about this, your response should be nice and simple. If you want to talk about this, please call my parent. They'll be happy to speak to you. That's it. They don't need to talk about what they meant on that post. They don't need to explain what their perspective is on Palestine. They don't need to justify anything. And kids don't also have constitutionally protected rights, FYI. And they are permitted to post, so long as it's not a safety threat. The problem is if they use any kind of violent language, right? So teach your kids to be smart about that. But other than that, if they say there's a genocide in Palestine happening and they get questioned on that, their response should be, teacher, principal, with all due respect, if you want to speak about this issue, please contact my parent. That's what they told me. And let them contact you. Don't let them explain what their perspectives are. All right, so the last thing I'm going to say and do is, so how do we talk about Palestine in a powerful way that, again, utilizes some hikmah based on all of these things that I've said? Truth is that something wearing a keffiyeh has been challenged in the workplace. This was actually done by residents. I was up in Buffalo a couple weeks ago. We had a bunch of medical residents said, we got questioned and there was a complaint put into HR because we didn't say anything, it wasn't anything about our social media posts. We just wore keffiyehs when we walk in before we take off our jacket, and somebody reported it to HR as a safety threat or as a concern because they're not comfortable. This is to the extent in which they're trying to silence us. Okay. But we won't be silenced, because existing as a Palestinian or existing as somebody who supports the Palestinian cause is not in and of itself a safety threat that is credible. And that is what they want to make us feel. And if they do silence us, then they have won without doing anything. Right? So we cannot succumb to that. But what we can do is to utilize some hikmah in the way that we say things, and this is some of my suggestions. First of all, don't speak to media unless you're trained to speak to media. Or you have talking points that have been vetted by an organization, like a Palestinian organization or something. They'll tell you the words to use and not to use. They'll tell you don't use the word conflict. It's not a conflict. Conflict implies that both sides are balanced and equal. That's not what this is. You know, even small things like that, right? So just, number one, if you can speak to media, consult. Number two, use quotation marks from reputable sources. Maybe Muhammad can't say this, or, you know, Brother Mujahid can't say this, and you know if your name is Mujahid, you shouldn't say certain things. But we play around. I have a friend who's a young kid. His name is, I won't say the last name, but the first name, last name, well, Mujahid. From the time he was going back and forth in the airport, they would constantly ask to question him, and his mom would say, here he is, and she'd pick up the high chair, and he was like 3 months old. It was pure profiling, pure profiling. That's all it is, okay? But what you want to do is, for example, you take quotation marks from the United Nations, from anywhere that is reputable, and you say, according to the United Nations, quote, da-da-da-da, 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 right? And you can basically say anything that they have said, right? Because you're simply doing what every journalist and every person does. You're citing a reputable source, first. Secondly, have a few talking points that are impactful, right? For example, for our kids, I tell them to say something like, you know what, I got sick last week. I had the ability to go visit a doctor and get some medicine. But little kids in Palestine can't do that because they've got no medicine and they often die untreated. Now, how impactful is that? Have they said anything that could be interpreted to a safety threat? No. In other words, you want to keep your narrative pro-Palestine, pro-basic human rights, instead of anti-something else. Right? That is the core of how you should message everything, right? X amount of people have died, according to the UN until now. Bombs are left, bombs have completely obliterated medical facilities, according to so-and-so, right? In other words, you are giving the information that is impactful, and you can put emotion into it, but do it in a way that is not anti-anything. Do it in a way that is pro-Palestinian life, pro-basic decency, for goodness sakes. And that is the way you appeal to the masses anyway. Because frankly speaking, you're not asking them to take a side, you're just asking them to be a decent human being. Right? So center around that. My sister wanted to ask a question. The conflation? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the issue is that everything that we've been saying that's pro-Palestinian is automatically interpreted as anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitic, 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 right? There's a conflation, meaning a complete disregard of the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. It's like they're switchable, but they're not switchable. Technically speaking, I'm a Semite. I come from the Middle East, right? And by the way, I taught my kids that, and I've done this also within CARE New York. When something anti-Semitic happens, meaning that is anti-Jewish, we don't use the word anti-Semitic anymore. There's a reason for that. Anti-Semitic shouldn't mean just against the Jews. I'm a Semite, I'm not Jewish. And why do I insist on that? If it's anti-Jewish, let's call it anti-Jewish, anti-Judaism. So if somebody paints a swastika on a synagogue, we're gonna call it out as CARE New York. We're gonna say, you know, an anti-Jewish hate crime should be investigated. But I won't say anti-Semitic, because what does Semitic mean? Well, if Semitic means that you're from a certain region, meaning the entire Middle East area, and we're now pushing this idea that anti-Semitic means anti-Jewish or anti-Judaism, then doesn't that also then mean that you're really approving of the idea that the entire Middle Eastern region is connected to Judaism? Right? Words have power. So I'm separating those two now, very conscientiously. If we mean anti-Jewish, anti-Judaism, we say anti-Jewish, anti-Judaism. But everything that we're doing under Palestine, and there's no room for anti-Semitism, we will never ever condone it. Anti-Jewish, it's not in our faith. But we will also push back and say, listen, this is a tired old game. I've been hearing it since the time I was a kid. Everybody recognizes it at this point. Being anti-Israeli policy or anti-genocide is not the same as being anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic. And we have to push back against this conflation, which our elected officials are still doing and saying to this day. Right? And that's why to have a keffiyeh in and of itself becomes anti-Semitic. No, it's not. So we have to constantly push back and challenge this entire conflation between anti-Zionism, and it's pretty easy to do. I mean, you just say, hey, if I say something against any Muslim country, does that mean I'm anti-Muslim or Islamophobic? No, I'm against the particular regime or the particular policy. Same applies there. If I say something against China, am I anti-Chinese or anti-Buddhist or Confucius? That's ridiculous, right? Why is there this exception for Israel? The two can't be conflated. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna stop here because I know I've spoken for a long time. I apologize. There is a lot to go over for these types of things. I wanted to just let you know that I also have resources here. We were talking about being very vocal. I'm gonna ask you all to please make sure that you are vocal whenever you see or experience anything, or your children or family members, neighbors, whatever, because us Muslims only report things at 4%. According to our Feeling the Hate report that we did about a year ago. Even with hate crimes and bias incidents, only 4% of the Muslim population reports anything. 4% to law enforcement agencies. And there are different reasons for that. But you have to report, and if you don't want to report to them or you need help reporting to them, please, at the very minimum, every time something happens, even if it's just to report that something happened, report it to us. Why? Because we need the data. Because when I do go to these DOE meetings, I need the data. I need the numbers. I need to say, just like they're saying anti-Semitism is up X amount percentage, if we don't have the numbers, then where do the resources and the emphasis goes? So we need the data. Somebody says something to you as you're going across the street, report it to us. That's a discriminatory incident. That's a bias incident. It's not a hate crime, but it's a bias incident, right? So report so that we have the data to push back. Now, I'll open it up to questions. Again, I apologize if I went over time. I know that I have, and it's Maghrib time, so I don't want to hold off. No, that's fine. Wayakum. So here's the reason why I wouldn't suggest you do that. Let's say somebody, unless it's a violent thing and it's, you know, truly a safety threat to you or to someone else, okay? And you should, by the way, a lot of times when you get doxxed and you get posted and you're plastered everywhere, there's a lot of safety threats that come along with that, sometimes violent threats, and you should report those. The reason is if you go, let's say somebody who's pro-Zionist says some things. Now you go to HR and you make the complaint. Essentially, you're validating the idea that they are permitted to punish or penalize people based on their social media policies. Generally, as a civil rights organization, we don't want that, right? We want everybody's rights to be protected equally. Now, what we suggest to you is that you should be documenting That's the proactive tool to take. Don't take it to HR. Just document, especially if you know it's hot button issue like the way this is. Document what you're seeing from other people so that if you get called in, you now have documentation as to all the other things that are being said and done to protect yourself, right? So, but I do understand the defensive versus proactive. If you want to be proactive, what I would say is wait till this dies down. Go back to your social media policies, and if you see that they allow for you to be, or anyone to be disciplined based on private protected speech, you should request that your company changes those and be on the offensive that way versus calling out somebody because now they're going to call you out or they're going to call another Muslim out that's done this, and now people are getting called in, losing their jobs. And in most cases, we're going to get the worst end of it, right? Yep, absolutely. It goes back to what we were saying. You shouldn't be speaking to law enforcement, period. So I'll tell you what's happening now. People are being questioned now. The latest wave that are being questioned is with everything that's happened and Yemen's intervention in what's happened, the Houthis, which is the ruling party right now in northern Yemen at least, have now, by the Department of Homeland Security, been designated a terrorist organization, okay? What does that do for everybody who's either supporting their family back home financially or whatever? It becomes a sensitive issue now. We've gotten word for a couple of high, Yemeni populations that FBI have been going in and asking them about their political perspectives. Do they support or not support the Houthis? Now, regardless of what your opinion is, first of all, you're an American. You don't have to verify what your opinion is on any political issue. Who are you to come and question me on whether or not I support any political regime, number one. But besides that, they've now been designated a terrorist organization. So if you say, yeah, it's not really as bad as what the media makes it out to be, or my cousin knows them, or anything like that, now you're supporting a terrorist organization now, right? That's a very big problem and a very serious problem, right? So that's why we tell you, do not speak to anyone in terms of law enforcement, whether you're 5 years old, 15 years old, 50 years old, or 85 years old. Do not speak to a law enforcement agent. You have us. That's what we're here for. We're your barrier. We're your wall. Somebody comes in, Agent so-and-so, please slip me your business card. I'll have my attorney contact you. We will call them. What do you want to question about? If there's something legitimate, we'll talk it over with you. We'll see whether or not it's in your interest to meet with them. If it's something that's illegitimate, it's phishing, it's a no. You don't need to meet with them, period. So are they allowed to do it? No. Can they do it internally? Right? But this is what I'm going to tell you. If you open up your mouth, to be honest, you've dug yourself into a hole. Don't do it. The risk is real, and you've created that risk for yourself. That's the definite. If they put you on a watch list, well, we know that about 98% of the watch list is already Muslim anyway. And you're going to react if you're put in the Muslim watch list in certain ways, and we can go through that at another time. But the point is the definite risk that you are opening yourself to criminal liability comes along with you opening up your mouth in most cases. So don't do it. Mhm. 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 Okay. Fantastic question. Jazakallah khair for reminding me of that. And before I just do that, one of the things that I didn't mention, and it should go without saying, but since I spoke about, the Houthis terrorist designation and whatnot, same thing is with Hamas. You all know that Hamas, I don't know what your personal opinions are, but the point is they are also a designated terrorist organization. So you cannot go online, for example, and say, Hamas is nothing but freedom fighters who are fighting against oppression or whatever. Hamas, that could be your personal opinion, but they are, by the United States government, a designated terrorist organization. You saying things that in some way show support will, in most likelihoods, get you an FBI visit. Okay? So do not say that. I had one woman question and say, hey, at something that we're holding, can I have like the pictures of the martyrs from Hamas? I was like, are you crazy? No. So really, so understand that. And then in terms of your question, do citizens and non-citizens have the same rights? The general answer is yes. Just because you're a non-citizen, that does not mean that you do not have rights. You can still go to the protests. You can still do these other things. You can still have free speech rights. The problem is if you run into criminal difficulty and you're not a citizen, that could impact your immigration status and application. So you want to be a lot more careful. Point taken with some kids that were in protest that got called into their school. They're on student visas. Does the school need to sponsor them anymore? You see where it ends up being problematic? Okay. Or especially criminal violations. Criminal violations can trigger real problems with your immigration status. The other place where it makes a big difference is at the border, at the airports. So you have the right of return as a citizen, even if you're the worst criminal in the entire world. They'll let you come in as a citizen, they'll bring you into jail, but they'll let you in. You'll be in the United States. When you're a non-citizen, you don't have an automatic right to entry. And that's where you can get the issue. So if you're going to engage in things, you want to be safe about it and certainly talk to an immigration attorney so that you're protecting yourself from any criminal issues or student issues that can trigger your applications and processes. Any other questions? So an arrest is not a conviction, but having said that, you know that they ask about these things and can ask you, right? And so you really kind of want to protect yourself, and that's why we say be careful when you're a non-citizen if you're going to engage in things that could lead to any criminal liability of any kind, right? So speak to somebody first, see what your application is, how strong it is, what the issues are before you engage. Okay, I heard an adhan go off. Any other questions, or should we wrap? Okay. Welcome. Alhamdulillah. So inshallah, it's our pleasure again here. So we have a couple of resources here. It's only those small things, but most of our resources are obviously online, including a protester guide, a law enforcement guides, all kinds of templates and things for you guys to use. Go to the website, and if you want to stay alerted with updates and things like that, please sign on to this. I was going to pass it along, and I forgot. Now it's the law time, so I don't want to. And anybody that came late, take a KYR card, please, a Know Your Rights card with law enforcement. Okay. Something you can easily have in your pocket. And again, jazakumullah khair. I'll hang out here if there are any last questions after salah, inshallah.